Hi, this is Jim, W6LG or YouTube Elmer for Ham Radio Basics. Welcome to my radio room here in Rockland, California. A couple of weeks ago, I received an email from Eric Guth, 4Z1UG in Israel, asking if he could do an interview of me for his podcast. And we did that. Eric is incredibly well organized. So far, they've interviewed about 300 ham radio operators from around the world. I think I'm number 320. Those interviews, by the way, are located at qsotoday.com. And the name of the podcast is QSO Today Amateur Radio Podcast. Anyway, Eric asks a lot of neat questions, and it's not rehearsed, it's not scripted, it happens live, and that's it. Anyway, if you want to hear a little bit more about me, Eric's interview goes into my beginnings in ham radio and some of my experiences. I would encourage you to go to his website at qsotoday.com and look at the list of ham radio operators. You're going to recognize some of the names. There may be some of your friends on there, and there are some guys that you've heard about, like Riley Hollingsworth. I would encourage you to click on and listen to some of those interviews. And in fact, what I'm doing is I'm just clicking on them randomly of names I don't recognize and listening to the interview. It's certainly entertaining, and I've learned a lot. I get a different perspective on ham radio from these guys. All right, so here goes. Here is the interview of me by 4Z1UG in Israel that was uploaded yesterday to his podcast called QSO Today Amateur Radio Podcast at qsotoday.com. So here goes.
My QSO today is with Jim Heath, W6LG, who has been a ham for over 56 years. Jim is an Elmer's Elmer with an amazing YouTube channel with over 30,000 subscribers, where he not only reviews the basics of amateur radio, but he makes that content up close and personal, reflecting on his experience as an amateur radio operator. W6LG, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Jim?
I am. 4Z1UG, this is W6LG in Rockland, California.
Jim, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Before we start at the beginning of your ham radio story, where is Rockland, California?
Rockland is a rocky land located east of Sacramento in the Sacramento Valley. We moved here about a year ago from a place called Grass Valley, which was at a higher elevation, about 2,000 feet. This location's at the valley floor, and Rockland, Rocklin, was mostly rock quarries, and it got subdivided through the 80s, 90s, and even currently into large subdivisions. So it's a mix of residential and commercial. So there's shopping centers on almost every major intersection.
Are you HOA there?
We are.
Okay, so we're going to have to talk a little bit, once we get past the beginning of your story, we'll talk a little bit about HOA and how that works for you.
Okay.
So let's start at the beginning of your ham radio story. When and how did it start for you?
In 1964, I got my novice license, and it was with 3 other friends in junior high. One of them had mentioned to me that he was going to take a course in the San Fernando Valley. And I went along because it sounded like a lot of fun. And at that time, the novice license was administered usually by a club. And it was a fairly simple exam, except we did not have the questions and answers ahead of time. We had study guides, but not the precise question. And you had to pass 5 words per minute, sending and receiving. At that time, the license was good for 1 year and not renewable. So you either upgraded or you were finished. And so there was this pressure to upgrade, which I did do to general.
Let's go back a little bit. Did you have an interest in electronics and radio even before your friend said he was going to take the test?
I sure did. I was the kid who took apart everything he could get his hands on to see how it worked, much to the dismay of my parents, who found things broken that I had taken apart. But yes, I did, and I was really curious about how things worked electronically. So I built a shortwave receiver, At that time, there were catalogs, and I would collect those catalogs from Allied and Lafayette and other places and page through them for hours on end, looking at the various parts, and occasionally would build some of the kits. For example, Heath kit was out there, and I built some Heath kit projects. So yeah, I had an interest in it, and still do to this day. I enjoy building a lot.
Was your father also enamored with electronics? Did somehow that run off on you?
No, I was unique in the family in that regard. He worked in the studios and was interested in film, but no interest in ham radio. My brother was an athlete and a good student, and eventually became a judge, as a matter of fact, in LA County. But no, I was the only one that had an interest in it, and they encouraged it. They thought it was a good thing, and it was.
Now, before we started, you said your father worked in the studios. We're talking about the Burbank studios, probably, right? Which was the center of television in the 60s.
He did not. My grandfather worked at Warner's and was a assistant director there on a lot of movies. If you go to imdb.com and type in Frank Southwell Heath, he's got, I think, a couple of hundred credits. My father has quite a few too, but he was mostly at Desilu and worked for Lucy and Desi. In fact, for those who are Trekkie fans, you'll see his name at the end of Star Trek as post-production executive.
Oh, that's pretty amazing. Our paths might have crossed there. How about that?
And how would that be?
So one of my friends at the time, his father was a director of half of the early Star Trek episodes, a guy named Leo Penn.
Oh, yeah, sure. I spent a lot of time at the studio, and Desilu was located in the old RKO studio, and Paramount was on the other side of the wall. And when I would go to the studio, I was usually assigned somebody to keep track of me, like a handler. And I would go to the prop department and go to the microphones and radios. And it was a lot of fun to look at all the old microphones and radios. I spent hours there looking at stuff.
Yeah, I bet they had a lot of great stuff.
They did.
Okay, so you got your novice in 1964. How old were you then?
I was born in 1949, so I would be 15. Actually, would have been prior to my 15th birthday, so 14 years old. And then at that time, you had to take the general class exam or the tech exam at the FCC office in your area. In our case, it was downtown LA.
Right on Flower Street or something like that.
Yeah, it was a federal building, and it was, for a youngster, it was pretty intimidating.
I'm sure. What was your first call sign?
WN6JZC.
You did upgrade to general class?
I did. As I said, you had to take the test downtown LA, and I failed it the first time. You had to copy 13 words per minute, 65 characters. And it was in a room that I can still smell that room. There were wood desks on rails, one attached to the other. So the part you were writing on was relatively small, and it was attached to the seat of the guy in front of you. And if he moved, your desk moved. And in this room, and maybe it isn't necessary, but there was windows down the left side and the forward side. The forward side were the FCC employees. The left side was a gallery, or place for people to watch. The room had wood paneling, and it was really echoey, and the guy would start a machine that sent CW, and you had to copy, and they sent, I think, for 5 minutes, and you had to have 65 characters in a row correct. If you had 60 that were correct, you failed. Even if you had 60 and then 60 again, if there was a mistake in the middle, you failed.
It's my understanding, and I think I heard this from Gordon West, that they used to transmit that CW test over some kind of like AC, very low frequency transmitter, and use wireless headsets.
Not when I took it. No, it was large speakers above a machine that played a tape. I recall it being like a paper tape of some kind. It was,
Oh, like an instructograph.
yes, it's what it was. There was 50 to 60 in the room, about half would fail. The receiving part, a small percentage would fail. The sending part, that guy was tough. You had to send perfectly with a straight key, and then you took the written exam after that. So it was a three-step process.
So you finally passed the second time you went in.
I did, yeah.
And your call sign upgraded to WA6?
They were WB6s at that point. There was a huge influx of amateur radio operators at that time.
What was your first rig like?
I was pretty lucky. I had a Johnson Viking Ranger, bought at Henry Radio on Olympic Boulevard in L.A., and I had a Hallicrafters SX-111, which was a pretty darn good station for a novice.
And what did you like working?
At that time, you had no choice. You were crystal controlled. So it was CW, and I was on 40 meters, put up an inverted V, got on the air with that. It wasn't very high, but I sat up on the roof and put together a dipole, and I didn't have an SWR meter, probably didn't even know what one was. Just put it up, hooked up RG58, went on the air.
Well, with a Johnson Viking Ranger, I think you could tune the final and actually probably match the antenna with the output.
Yeah, you could. It had a generous tank circuit, and you could load just about anything and have fun. And we did. We had a lot of fun. At that time, since you were crystal controlled, you might call CQ on one frequency and then have to tune. We had 7150 to 7200 on 40. So your crystal may be 7152, and the guy that's calling you is 20 or 30 kilohertz higher. You had to tune up and down and look for that guy. And that's what we did. So we were always kind of split. And at that time, not many hams had transceivers, and it was mostly a transmitter and a receiver.
You were living there in the golden age of ham radio clubs, I would think, as well. Did you belong to a ham radio club as a teenager?
I was so lucky in that regard. There was a company in Burbank called Lockheed Aircraft. And they had a huge organization called the Lockheed Employees Recreation Club, Amateur Radio Club. And a guy named Bill Welsh, his call sign was WA6VTL, and his wife, Marie, was WA6VTM. They moved out from the East Coast and geared up novice classes. And they ran thousands of people through their classes month after month, and were generous with their time and coaching. If you needed something, Bill Welsh was at your front door to help you out. And so there was that radio club with about 120 to maybe 200 members, and they were creating novices by having these classes. And I took the general class course with them, and that's how I passed the test downtown LA. Did
you do your field days with them?
I did, and they were great. They would go to one of the local parks. Burbank had lots of parks. Burbank was good in that they encouraged ham radio. In fact, I was member of the Burbank Civil Defense. I still have the badge. I hung on to that. And they had, I think, 100 ham radio operators as part of their group of responders.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
I tried, but it did not. I went to Pierce College, and I received an A.S. in business and a B.S. No, it was an A.A. and a B.S. at Cal State Northridge in finance. At that time, I was encouraged not to take engineering courses by the counselors at Cal State Northridge, and their response was that, and this was 1969 to 1971, that there are no jobs for engineers. So do business, and that's what I did.
That's very interesting, because I think I remember that time. That was right after we landed on the moon.
Yeah.
So Southern California was very heavy engineering all the way up into that point, and then all of a sudden the landing on the moon, and then engineering was over.
When you said that, it reminded me of where I was at the time. In Burbank, there were 3 stores that sold ham radio equipment. I worked at 2 of them. In Burbank, there were 3 places where you could go and buy something. And one of them was a place called Electronic City. And I was in that store at that time. And we had Collins, Drake, Galaxy, Swan, Hallicrafters. We had the complete Collins S line on display in the console. And it was a neat place to work. And during that time, the landing, I was in the store.
I remember that day as well. I was in Canoga Park watching it on television, so that was really cool.
Yeah, it was amazing. We had pictures. As rough as they were good.
How did you end up pursuing your career then? And did amateur radio play a part in that at all?
It, for the most part, did not up until later in life. I ended up working for a company that was 1% of the gross national product of the country. It was the #1 retailer in the country, and I spent a lot of years at Sears Roebuck and moved from store to store and facility to different facilities. And it was a good place to work. It was a neat company with neat people. After that, I went to work for Los Angeles County as an appraiser. And then ultimately, we relocated to Grass Valley. I worked for the county, the Grass Valley area called Nevada County. And later in life, due to an accident, and I mean an accident, I ended up manufacturing motorized mobile antennas for about 10 years.
Let's go back a second, if you don't mind. You were working at Sears Roebuck at a time, I think, probably, would you say it was after 1970? So you actually, after you graduated?
Yeah.
And I think they were building stores like crazy in Southern California in those days.
They were. Like I said, it was a good company. Each store was almost a city. In one of the stores I worked at, we had an optometrist, we had a key guy, we had all kinds of, we had tuxedos, you name it. There were all these ancillary things that made money for the store. We had carpenters, security guys. There were probably 1,000 employees in that store. One of them was in Long Beach that I worked at, and then downtown LA and El Monte. It was a neat company. Nice folks.
Well, my father was opening make companies in those days.
Ah, yeah.
When you're talking about moving store to store, we were like military brats moving from city to city.
Yeah. A lot of my friends went to work for a make company. In fact, my brother-in-law worked for a make company in Whittier.
Oh, how about that? My father opened Westminster.
Ah, okay. My wife worked at the Westminster Sears.
Yeah, in fact, as I remember, this is a ham radio aside for a second, that Sears was the first department store in Southern California to actually open on Sunday, as I recall.
I believe that to be the case, yeah.
Because I remember going there with my dad once. He was kind of doing some spying for the May Company to see what Sears looked like on a Sunday, whether it was busy. And as I recall, it was quite busy. So I think that's probably set the ground for everyone to be open on Sunday. Now, you talk a little bit about an accident that you had, and I think that it sounded to me like, at least when I read, was that accident was kind of pivotal in terms of the way that you changed your life. Do you want to talk a little bit about that kind of accident and maybe how that could apply to hams?
Well, I guess there actually have been 2 series of events that were life-changing. In 1988, I was working as a self-employed building inspector and expert witness. I would testify in court on construction defects. And it was a rainy day, and I went to look at a building and climbed up the ladder and fell. I fell roughly 14 feet, was knocked unconscious, and broke my neck and a lot of bones. I fell across some steps, and that really brought doing any kind of building inspection work to a halt. And a local guy had started manufacturing these motorized antennas, and I purchased the rights to his antenna and started manufacturing, and we did really well for about 8 to 10 years doing that. And it was a lot of fun. We traveled to a lot of shows, went to Florida. We did a couple of different shows in Florida. Of course, we went to Dayton.
What was the name of that company?
High Sierra Antennas. And we were at Dayton, the smelly building. on the other side of the wall from Bob Heil and Heil Sound. That's where I met folks like Ray Novak from ICOM and other guys who were major players in the ham radio business. Really enjoyed it.
Did you stay in the ham radio business? You were doing the High Sierra antennas for 8 years. Did you close it or did you sell it off and move on?
Well, that was kind of the second accident. Not to dwell on it too much, but in November 2nd, 2016, I had gone to emergency rooms during the course of the year prior to that with some complaints, shortness of breath and other things. And it was blamed on just working too hard. Well, it wasn't. And I suffered massive pulmonary embolisms. We called 911. It was 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And it does relate to ham radio, and I'll explain why in a second. I was rushed code 3 to the hospital. They gave me the right kind of test. And on that test, if you score higher than 500, you're in trouble. I scored the highest that anybody had scored at that hospital. And by the way, I had worked at that hospital as an accountant for 3 years, in between moving up there and going to work for the county. 12,216. In fact, it was so notable that they wrote it on the whiteboard above me, and doctors came in just to talk to me about it. My lungs literally had filled with blood clots, and I couldn't breathe. So they did a scan after the blood test and found that I had almost no lung capacity left. And Lovenox was applied then several times over the next week. I was in intensive care for a week, and then I was discharged to home. As a result of that episode, I suffered lung damage, lost about 25% of my lung capacity, and heart damage. And subsequent to that, I have been diagnosed with severe osteoporosis. I have the bones of a 90-year-old person. And as a result of all that, I've surrendered my driver's license, and we moved from the mountaintop, where I had 3 towers up, to the valley floor to be in an area that's relatively flat and close to our oldest son and his wife, who can come by here when needed, and they have.
You actually brought this pulmonary embolism up earlier than I was going to ask about it. And the reason I was going to ask about it is you actually did a YouTube video about it. You want to explain how that applies to ham radio? Because I thought that that's really a message that hams should hear, actually.
It does, and it was a difficult video to make. I'm having difficulty talking about it now. We're not sure what caused my lungs to fill up the way they did. It didn't occur overnight. It didn't occur in a week's time. I say a week's time because I'd been in the ER a week prior to that. It occurred over a period of time, and it may be that as a result of sitting at a desk too long, that I was developing blood clots in my legs, and they were working their way into my heart and lungs. And as a result of that, the lungs filled up with the blood clots to the point where I couldn't breathe. And that's where we knew we had to call 911. So for those who operate contests or sit at a desk for a long period of time or chase DX, the word from the doctors is get up and move. Get up and drink lots of water, which I wasn't doing, but move. And they recommend 30 to 45 minutes, get up and walk around. So if you are in a contest, you're going to have to get up. If you don't, you run the risk of forming blood clots. And a huge number of people who do that do not make it to the emergency room. Something like 75% die on the way there because you can't exchange oxygen into your blood. So it's critical to move. And that's why I did the video. Get up and move. As I said, we're not sure what caused mine. It may be related to something else, but the damage for me has been done, and there's no fixing it. It's the way it is. But the good news is I survived the event, and a lot of folks don't.
Well, I think that deep vein thrombosis is actually the term for sitting too long and causing the clots in the legs. I know that when you travel internationally, oftentimes they'll tell you that what you should be doing is, every hour or so get up and walk around a little bit to kind of get the circulation back in your legs. But, as a ham radio operator and as a guy that works a desk, it's easy to spend hours and hours at your desk and not moving. And you can have the same deep vein thrombosis in your legs, especially as you get older, if you're sitting too long.
The other side of that is also to drink water, to force feed water, even though you're not thirsty. Keep fluids, keep pushing fluids. It's a serious disease, and it kills a lot of people, and it's not discussed. The fix for that is not a great one either. I won't mention the drugs that I've been on, but they're highly advertised on TV. They have their own, and boy, this is off topic, they have their own set of problems. So in fact, and I'll end it with this. My doctor entered a new diagnosis on a list of things that's wrong. And the new diagnosis is long-term user of anticoagulants, because there are significant issues with doing that. So if you're a ham radio operator and you're operating contests, or you're sitting at a desk, or whatever you're doing, get up and move. If you have a cell phone, set a timer on it for 45 minutes, get up and move, and do that with a glass of water.
Great advice. I've had guests on in the past that have had serious medical conditions that affect ham radio operators. And so I think it's always good that when we can, we should touch on those things. I think that we're like your generation and mine. I'm not far behind you, but I think we're the first generation that is really spending more time in chairs than we do out of chairs, right? And so we've kind of set in motion a new lifestyle that our children are following, and that is that we don't get as much exercise as we used to because we work in chairs instead of, working outside.
Yeah, I think that's true for programmers and other folks. My son is an IT guy and probably sits too long.
Having a standing desk could also be an interesting way to get around that.
Like Rumsfeld did, yeah. Stand up and move around and just even a few minutes of moving and just get up and move.
I'd like to talk about your YouTube channel, but before we do that, let's talk about what the current rig is. It's very impressive on your YouTube channel because you've got a lot of really cool stuff. Could you talk a little bit about what the current rig is? And because you live in an HOA area that you said earlier before, what all that equipment connects to?
When I worked at the store in Burbank that sold hammered equipment, I fell in love with Drake stuff and still do to this day. I just think it was neatly designed. The closest, maybe it's a stretch, but the closest equivalent, and maybe the folks at Elecraft wouldn't agree, is Elecraft reminds me of Drake. It's just so well designed. So I really like Elecraft equipment, and I've been fortunate to be able to have a couple of K3s. So the current station is a couple of K3s. I have a Yaesu FT450 with a handle on the side that's a great transceiver to take out and use outside and play with. I have an Elecraft amplifier, KPA 500, and an Elecraft antenna tuner, some Drake antenna tuner, some Drake watt meters. One of the things I have enjoyed doing and plan on doing again soon is I like building things like whether it's antenna switches or more complicated things like linear amplifiers. I've built several over the years, and antennas. Antennas are lots of fun. And you asked about HOAs. The HOA for this subdivision is extinguished for the most part. There is a county general plan, and I live in a city, and the city has adopted the county general plan, and it is pretty strict. To back up just a bit, I did do some time as a county building inspector and as a county tax assessor, deputy building inspector, deputy tax assessor. I also served as a planning commissioner in Nevada County. I was on the fire code board, the building code board, the board of appeals, um, numerous committees, Aries races, participated in several emergencies. During the big fire in Nevada County, I was the head of the communications group, and we had 120 ham radio operators involved in that. So the city of Rockland has a height limit of 30 feet, and they enforce that. So I have spoken to the chief building official, and 30 feet is permissible, 31 is not. So I have constructed an antenna tower that has a maximum height of 30 feet. And I use a little box that I've designed to run it up and down because it's a little hard for me to crank the handle. So it has a winch. And in the last few weeks, I've added a device to pulse the motor so it goes up and down smoothly and quietly. Right now, I'm working on a limit to keep it at 30 feet and no higher.
So that antenna goes up when you want to operate, or it's up all the time?
That's what I'm trying to accomplish, is with it all the way down, it's at about 20 feet, and then run it up when I'm on the air, and then bring it down when I'm not. And I'm doing that manually right now. The original motor, which was from a local automotive supply house, at 12 volts was just too noisy and too fast. So I built a power supply with a Variac, which weighed a lot, and I would haul it outside and run it up and down while I got smart. And I used a switching supply and pulse width modulation, which I'm going to do a video about, to run it up and down, and it maintains the torque on the motor, but allows me to go very slowly, just crawl as it goes up, so as not to attract the neighbors.
And what kind of antenna do you have on top of the tower?
At my old location, I had 3 towers. I had 6.5 acres on the top of Wolf Mountain in Nevada County, and I had phased Yagis on 20. When we moved, I sold off the towers and kept one, and I brought all the tubing, which was occupying a good portion of the yard, so I've had to put it in various places where it's kind of out of the way. With that tubing, I constructed a 3-element monoband Yagi for 20 meters. So it's 3 elements on an 18-foot boom, and it's a pretty simple design, but it's just one that I sort of cobbled together out of pieces from other antennas, and it works great.
And of course, you have wire antennas for the other.
I'm a big fan of wire antennas, especially dipoles. And I talked to a guy yesterday who just got on the air. He's a half mile away, and was encouraging him to build his own dipole. It's simple to do, and string it up and have fun on HF.
Now, in your place, do you actually have other 30-foot poles to hold up the ends of your dipole?
I don't. Right now it's tied to the fence, and the fence is about 8 feet tall. So it's more like an inverted V. Behind the house is open space that belongs to the city. I would love to string an antenna into one of those trees, but I think that would probably not be a good idea. So I'm staying on the property, and I've gone to the fence. And even though it's not as high as I would like, it actually works pretty well.
Now, you've got 2 rigs. I also saw what looked like 2 Drake amplifiers on the right side.
You've got good eyes. I do. One is a highly modified Drake L4B with a power supply and higher plate voltage, and some other things. There's some flaws in the L4B in that the on and off switch will fail, so it's got a device to turn it on with not the front panel switch, but a relay, and some other things. By raising the plate voltage, you had to add some bias. And that's kind of the fun of modifying equipment. What can you do to make it better? The other one is very much a different amplifier on the inside. I have a good friend in Russia, and he provided some Russian tubes, and I put one of those Russian tubes into that amplifier, and it has a power supply that's about 70 or 80 pounds, and it runs 1,500 watts, cool as can be.
Now, are you a contester? I mean, you've got 2 K3s parked side by side. Do you operate SO2R or something like that?
No, I a couple things. I enjoy DXing. I've worked every country in the world, including North Korea, and that's been a lot of fun. I've had some just phenomenal contacts with guys like JY1 King Hussein, and received a QSL card signed by him. Neat guy. I can still hear his voice. It was a truly fun thing to work that guy. Father Moran in Nepal, 9-1 Mike Moran. A guy on Galapagos Islands, HC8FN, Forrest Nelson. So I enjoy chasing DX and got hooked on that in the early part of my career as a ham radio operator, probably 1967 or so. At that time, of course, there wasn't the internet. And I used to get on the phone with a buddy in the Valley, and we would hear something and then call each other and say, there's this DX on this frequency, and we would do that all morning long before we went to school.
Do you have a favorite operating mode?
Yeah, I do. It's not CW, it's sideband, and I think the reason for that is I enjoy chasing DX, but I also enjoyed talking to somebody at length. It's amazing the people that you run into. Ham radio, as an aside, ham radio operators, it's an amazing group. It's a diverse group of mostly men, probably 95% men, and 5% women, but they run the gamut, and in many cases, their story is fascinating, and I've enjoyed chatting with folks, and in some cases become friends for more than 50 years with some of these guys. And ham radio operators are very generous, nice, for the most part, nice guys.
I get that. I think I believe that as well. After you're going to be number 320 here, so I've had 319, now 320 great conversations. As of this QSO, you have 146 videos and over 30,000 subscribers to your YouTube channel. Why did you start a YouTube channel, and what did you hope to achieve from it?
As I said, I grew up in Burbank, and I was lucky in a number of ways. There was the Lockheed Club, but there was almost a ham radio operator on every block. And so if you needed something or needed an explanation on how something worked or getting something going, you didn't have to walk very far because I didn't drive at the time. You could go over to that guy's house, and they were willing to show you and oftentimes give you what you needed to get it going. One guy in particular, I went over to his house, and we became friends until he passed away. His call was W6BQW, Lou de Villeneuve, and his wife. And in fact, as an aside, their house was on the corner of a street, and across the street from that was the grammar school that I went to. And as kids, one of the dares that one kid would issue to another was to ride your bicycle up their driveway, up Pat and Lou's driveway, down their walkway, make the turn, go down the side of their house and down the other driveway. And I did that as a kid, much to the upset of Pat. I never told him the story, but I rode my bike and she yelled at me, "Oh, you kids," and that thing. Well, years later, I was there, almost every day with something or other. And Lou would help me. And Lou had a way of explaining things that was different from a lot of guys. And that was, he could break it down into, he was an engineer at Lockheed, but he could break stuff down into the simplest language and idea, and you could get it. You could understand it. You could go home and apply it. And I've tried to do that on YouTube. Today we have the expression Elmer, and I've tried to be a YouTube Elmer for basic ham radio things and apply explanations. I'm not an engineer, but I've had a fair amount of experience in explain why things work the way they do, or why they don't, or and in some cases it's as simple as how to set the mic gain on a transceiver, or to build a dipole antenna, or what happens to coax if water gets into it. Any number of things like that. And in fact, as I'm sitting here, I've got 3 or 4 projects in front of me that I intend to record the next few days. One of them is building a dummy load and how you do that. And in that discussion, talk about inductive reactance and capacitive reactance and how that applies in a dummy load. So I'm trying to pay back the guys that helped me. And most of these guys that I knew were from World War II and really enjoyed helping out the other younger hams in the area. And in my case, one guy in particular, and really became like a second father to me. He was just a great guy. And no matter what I needed or needed to have done, we'd go out to his garage and rummage through stuff and find the parts, and I'd go home and fix it. Or more than once, I put something in a wagon and rolled it over to his house to be fixed.
You received the Elmer Award from the ARRL. What is the Elmer Award, and why did you earn it?
Well, I was thrilled to get it. And a fellow on the East Coast, Mark W1, I'm going to, MFB, I'm going to say his call sign wrong, MFB, I think, applied and got it for me based upon my videos and helping him and others out. And I was ecstatic to receive that because it was validation that I'm helping some folks. The 30,000 subscribers amazes me. One of the videos has had over 400,000 views. And as I move through this part of my life where I'm disabled, it's good that I can do something and pay back. I can't go over and help a local guy put up an antenna. I can't lift anything anymore, but if I can show somebody how to make a dipole or how something works, for me, that's great.
Well, I think that one of the things that impressed me about the videos that you're making is that you're also, I kind of like the world as it is according to Jim. So every once in a while you'll have a ham radio related video, but it's kind of like your worldview on the subject.
There is that. There are some topics though that I don't discuss on the air. And when I'm operating on the air, I try to set the example of being the best that I can be. And I have this, I'll explain, I have this fear of us losing frequencies because a big business needs them. And we lose 20 meters. And so I encourage everybody to be respectful on the air, to get along the best we can, to not have arguments. I don't want to have somebody, and this is the thing that I envision, a company gets in front of the FCC panel and says, we want 20 meters. We can use it for X, Y, and Z, whatever it is. And they play a recording of some arguments going on or some negative things being said to the FCC. And it puts us in a bad light. So I think we should try to be the best we can be. And for 99% of us, that's not a problem. And for those who sort of cross that line, I've done this more than once, is to talk to them on the phone about their operating habits or maybe rethink what they're doing. Some folks you're not going to change, but some folks you can.
Are you an official observer?
No, I don't even know if that still exists. I am not. I think they were going to gin that up again, and I don't know where that's gone. I am a life member of the ARRL. I have been there. We need that organization. We need them to succeed and be influential. We need to support them because they're really the only folks that can help us out if somebody does decide they want to take a portion of a ham radio band.
Yeah, I interviewed in episode 311 Riley Hollingsworth, K4ZDH, and he was talking about that there's actually, through his efforts and the ARRL, there's now an officials observer organization now, at least, to monitor what's going on and we self-police.
I will check into that because Riley Hollingsworth is one of the best guys for ham radio ever. So if he's part of it, it's going to be good. There are a number of hams who are outstanding, and he is one of them.
Also a nice guy.
Yeah, he is. He had a difficult job though. Code enforcement, law enforcement isn't easy, and that's kind of what he was doing. You said the word ham. Do you know where that came from?
The word ham?
Mm-hmm.
You know what? I have my own ideas. Where do you think it came from?
Well, I've done a bunch of research on it. It comes from the days of telegraphy, before there was radio. And a telegrapher who was a poor operator would be referred to as ham-handed, and they had another term for him that was railroad related, like spur. That may not be the right word, but ham-handed, a guy who was sloppy in the way he sent or didn't know what he was doing. And I couldn't find it in any radio magazine or book through the teens. It appears in the early 1920s as a derogatory comment about guys who are on the air who are not commercial operators. And I confirmed some of that with 6 Delta Delta, Phil Keast, who was my neighbor. He was one of the first ham radio operators in California. He first went on the air about 1914. Great guy. And the expression ham was derogatory, but it stuck. And it had nothing to do with kids going in front of Congress with the initials HAM, which has been bandied about. It just was a comment about the way a guy would send and the lack of skill.
I'm looking in Merriam-Webster's dictionary, and it says ham-handed or ham-fisted was clumsy, graceless, heavy-handed. So perhaps that's where it came from, huh?
I believe that to be the case, yeah.
Your videos are great because your beautiful ham radio station is behind you. But I noticed on the left that you also have some test equipment. What is the most exotic piece of test equipment that you have behind you there?
I'm looking over there now. A lot of that is from surplus stores. The most exotic, probably the pan adapter is from the 1970s, kind of a neat thing. But today, we have equipment like the Nano VNA and other things that in the size of a deck of cards can outperform that device. And more things are coming our way, which is really neat. It's an exciting time to be a ham radio operator for many reasons. Digital communications, equipment that in years gone by would have been thousands of dollars, now is in the tens. $40, $50 you can buy something that will do amazing things. So as far as exotic equipment goes, probably some of the newer things. I enjoy antennas, so antenna analyzing devices are the things that I enjoy the most. I do have bird watt meters and a bird dummy load and stuff from the 1950s and 60s. But the exciting things are the things that are coming our way that are relatively new, that allow us to analyze what we're doing and how things work in a way that wasn't available to us just a couple of years ago.
Do you have a 30-second elevator pitch for ham radio? If you meet somebody on an elevator and they say, "Oh, you're a ham radio operator," do people still do that?
They do. And it's one of the first questions you get is, it still exists? And it does. It is, and especially today, as we're recording this conversation, part of California, a good percentage of it is on fire. And in many instances, ham radio is the only means of communications left. Cell towers can be destroyed during fires and earthquakes. We found during the fire in Nevada County the 49er fire, where we lost 300 houses and it was about 100,000 acres, that the state system became overloaded, which is likely the case today. And ham radio operators stepped up. There was 120 of them, along with guidance from I was volunteering with California Fire Department, CAL FIRE. A guy ran an amateur radio group, Charlie Jacobs, KC6LKC, and he had us organized to participate in fires, and we did several. And we provided backup communication. So ham radio, elevator pitch, ham radio is diverse. Just about anything that you can think of, you can do in ham radio, whether it's building, experimenting, digital communications, sending pictures, studying the sun, sending a signal from here to the other side of the planet to talk to a guy in Nepal or somebody in India or Pakistan, or just chatting with friends on the other side of the planet. I have friends in countries, some near you. One is an Air Force general. So if you want to just talk with somebody, if you want to experiment, if you want to get involved in computers, digital communications, even photography, there are facets of that in amateur radio. Talking to the space station, communicating through it. There are so many things you can do with amateur radio. It's absolutely amazing. Another thing I'd like to emphasize. Oftentimes, and it's true, someone will say, ham radio or amateur radio is a great hobby. It is. It really is. It's amazing. And I've been at it for 56 years. But it's also a licensed radio service. And I underline the word service. And ham radio operators are good at providing service. And in many cases, it's done quietly. During the 49er fire, for example, many ham radio operators were pressed into service, and their job was to be a quiet walkie-talkie in a way, and that they provided a second means of communications for the fire captain that they were assigned to. They didn't chat with the fire captain. They merely, when something came through that needed to be sent to that fire captain, provided that information in plain language. I emphasize plain language because that's the way it should be done. So we are a licensed radio service, which is one of the things that I mentioned to the city when I was talking to them. It's not just a hobby. First and foremost, it's a federally licensed radio service, and we provide a service in many instances that is absolutely needed. And I would say in California right now, in many locations, it is being used to provide secondary communications. And it may be simple things, and it may be complicated things. It may be tracking the fire. It may be somebody's assigned to a lookout tower where he or she is reporting the location of the fire. All of those things go on quietly in the background and don't always end up on the 6 o'clock news.
Well, I think one of the things that also people may not realize is that in all those areas where those fires are, all of that infrastructure is above ground, right? All that fiber, all that copper, everything that supplied, high-speed internet service to all of those residents up there, that infrastructure is now completely gone. So ham radio could be playing a role for some time until, that infrastructure is replaced with microwave cell towers or whatever else that needs to go into those places. But it seems to me that amateur radio operators will play a role for some time in these areas.
They will, and they will do it without compensation, and they will do it with a smile on their face, and they will do it for as long as they're needed. Ham radio operators are really good folks. I've benefited from that in ways that I haven't explained, but when I've needed help with something, you don't have to look very far. There's a guy in town who will help you. Oh, well, not necessarily just in town. It's a quick story. I'm recovering from the pulmonary embolism thing, and I'm in a special chair in the living room, and the phone rings, and it's a doctor on the East Coast, a heart surgeon. He looked my phone number up, got it, called, and left a message as I was sitting there to the effect that he was a doctor. If I needed any help understanding what was going on, that he was an expert in the field and he would be happy to help me. Now, here's a guy who's, by the way, he is a world-renowned doctor since retired, who took the initiative to contact me to say, "May I help you?" And that's an example of how nice ham radio operators can be when needed. They're generous.
Is he a ham radio operator?
Yes, he is. He has a phenomenal collection of gear, and we've become very friendly, and we chat once in a while. I'm not giving his name and call sign, but he is well known.
I actually may know him.
Okay.
But I won't say anything.
Yeah, neat guy. But just an example of, I did pick up the phone. As happened here during a recording, we get phone calls all day long where people are trying to sell you something, or a home loan or whatever, and so I tend not to answer the phone. And I was blown away by this guy, and you become skeptical initially, but in talking to him on the phone, what a neat guy. He had to take time out of his day to offer help.
Right.
To somebody he really didn't know.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it is.
I think that's what I found with ham radio. Mostly attracts very generous people who are generous with their time, and they like to teach, they like to mentor, they like to learn. I think maybe that's one of the great things about ham radio is it's a great hobby to learn. As you said earlier, you could learn anything and connect ham radio to it in some way. Do you have advice for new or returning hams?
Yeah, I do. Have fun. I have a different approach to getting the license, and some may not agree, and that's okay. Pass the test. And in some cases, it may be as simple as memorize the question and the correct answer and let it go at that, just to pass the test. You will learn as you do things. We have a resource today that's phenomenal, and you have to be careful about who you watch and listen to on YouTube, but the ARRL and other organizations, there's a whole bunch of information. So get on the air, especially HF. Get on HF and have fun. Communicate with people. I've said this many times. We're not broadcasters. We're communicators. Engage somebody in conversation. Ask them. There are some topics I don't discuss. I don't discuss religion, and I don't discuss politics, but everything else maybe is okay. You'll find connections with people that when you started out, you had no idea was there. So have fun, get on the air, build things, find the niche that interests you. Since there are so many different ways that you can, for example, you mentioned a HOA. Let's say you're in an HOA where antennas are absolutely forbidden. You can still get on the air, and you can still work the world. And I worked a guy in Mozambique doing this. Do a digital communications. The guy that's coming up with these schemes for digital communications is amazing. And you can have headphones on or a speaker running and hear nothing, but your equipment is decoding that guy's signal from the other side of the planet or from the other side of the country. And it's doing it 100% of the time. So there are lots of ways to get on the air and have fun and enjoy it. It is a thrill to talk to somebody either digitally or CW or whatever means that you want, satellites. It's just a whole bunch of fun and enjoy it. And as you experiment and build things, you'll learn. So you may not understand what SWR means or how to set the mic gain, but you'll get it figured out. And that comes after you pass the test. Pass the test, get on the air and have fun, and get to know people in your area if you can. Get to know the local ham radio guys. Get them to help you if need be. Understand how things work, but have fun. That's my advice.
Yeah, and usually all you have to do is ask.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be afraid of asking. You shouldn't be afraid of knocking on the door of the guy that has the antenna and asking for help.
And that's what I did, and it became a 50-year friendship with a guy on the corner across the street from the school.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I really appreciate your taking the time and sharing for all of those people that